I'm going to go live. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for another Jagged Globe presentation. Hi there, my name's Tom Briggs. I'm a climber and the marketing director at Jagged Globe. And this week I'm very excited to have Robert Mads Andersen with us. But first, just a quick reminder that next week we have expedition leader and 10-time Everest summiteer David Hamilton talking about trekking and mountaineering in the Karakoram. So, in 1988, Robert Andersen led the ascent of a new route on Everest's remote Kangshung Face without oxygen or Sherpa support, which was described by Reinhold Messner as the best ascent of Everest in terms of style and pure adventure. When he wasn't leading expeditions, Robert had an international career in the advertising business and was the creative director at a number of global ad agencies. Following the Kangshung Face expedition, he continued to climb and soloed the remainder of the 7 summits, including 2 new routes solo on Antarctica's Mount Vinson. His book, 7 Summits Solo, was published in 1995. With 17 Himalayan expeditions to his credit, Robert now guides on the 7 summits and in the Himalayas. He has led teams for Jagged Globe to the top of Everest twice, as well as Shisapangma, Cho Oyu and Makalu, the world's 5th highest mountain. Robert is leading our spring 2021 Everest expedition, so if you're thinking about climbing Everest next year, then please get in touch. The format of today's session will be a 40-minute presentation followed by up to 20 minutes of Q&A. So I'm going to bring in Robert now. Robert is currently at home in Manchester, England with his partner and fellow guide Josephine Clark, where they are plotting new adventures. His children Miles and Phoebe are at University in Auckland, New Zealand and the University of London respectively. Good morning, Robert. How are you on yet another sunny morning?
Good morning. Very good, thanks. I think it's a bit incongruous that the weather gets better and we're supposed to spend more time indoors, but I guess that's the way it goes.
That's right. So yes, you're going to talk to us about Everest today. So we're just going to rack up your slides here and send them across, and we're just going to dive straight in if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be great. I think quite a few people have heard so many stories of Everest that I thought it might be interesting today to look at kind of some of the things that I've learned through the different expeditions I've done, and how we kind of go in there and really look at it in 3 different stages. I think I've called this today Fear, Fitness, and Faith, not necessarily in that order, as you learn a little bit about the mountain. I think the first thing is if you're afraid of something is obviously sometimes to step back a bit and to look at it from far away. So if we go to the photo of the satellite picture of Everest, you can see it right here in the exact middle of the frame. On the left side in the sun is the Kangshung Face, which I'm going to show a few photographs from. On the right side in the shadow is the north face of Everest, very cold and obviously very chilly, and where the Chinese are right now, having been blown back twice it seems already this year, not having a particularly quick season. And then the other routes that I'll show pictures from, particularly up high, is the regular South Col route and the route that Hillary and Tenzing first did in 1953. So moving on, I thought I'd just look at, I think when you go to Everest, one of the first things that happens is you have this weight of history. And you've got Ed Hillary here on the left and Tenzing. I think when I first met Ed, I was fortunate enough to meet him in New Zealand and got to be relatively good friends with him, as he was told me about, he reckoned 65 pounds of weight up to the high camp before they went to the top. He was an amazing climber, probably one of the most talented of the climbers on the team. And he helped support some of our expeditions going over to the Kangshung Face. Here you see me on the left, Paul Tier, Ed Webster, and then on the right, Stephen Venables, who was the first British climber to summit Everest without oxygen. The lady of the lake there in the ice, you can see she was kind of a memento from our photographer who was along on the trip, who was missing some female companionship at the time, I would say. So we went to the east face of Everest, and there was some fantastic climbing. The stories about not getting any good climbing, and certainly if you go to do a new route on Everest, you don't have to face that, and you certainly don't see any crowds. We didn't meet anybody for 6 weeks, and then we had some amazing campsites up high, up at about 23,000 feet, 7,500 meters. Paul Tier and I pitching the tent. Just on the far left, you can see Makalu out on the horizon. We moved up relatively quickly, and Ed Webster took a picture of me on a very empty face. You see Lhotse behind me, the South Cole's directly behind, and we were climbing up early in the morning as we went to the top of the peak. Stephen Venables claimed when he got to the top, he'd taken the perfect picture and came back down and had one of an oxygen bottle, luckily with his reflection in a small piece of mirror. So the shot we really took after I came back from the South Summit and Stephen from the top was back down at the South Col, shot by Ed Webster. Of course, we headed back down the mountain, and I think one of the things I realized was we'd escaped luckily with our lives, but we had some bit of damage, and here's my fingers right after the expedition when I was in Lhasa. All of us that had been high had lost a few toes and a few fingers in some cases. But we came back, and as much as I'd kind of given up for a while, I went to the North Face a few times to try and solo that. And then I moved on to doing guiding. The first peak I ever guided was Shisapangma. And we went there without oxygen and got up in about 2 weeks. And I thought, wow, this is fun. I don't have to organize everything. I don't have to find sponsors. I don't really have to pay for it. In fact, I'll get paid. And I really enjoyed climbing with a whole range of people. So I went here to Cho Oyu and we summited. And then Jagged Globe called me up and said, oh, by the way, do you want to go back and do Everest? My picture was on the cover of a National Geographic Adventure of Ed Webster climbing out at the crevasse. And I really couldn't turn it down. It was too good an opportunity to go back and really see what the mountain looked like and hopefully get to the summit this time. The next one is a video, and we'll hope that it'll play. It's rather large, but it comes in literally across Tibet, and then it goes up over the Khumbu Icefall, up to Lhotse, and circles back around. It takes about 1.5 minutes, but I think it takes us from where we are now, home in our houses, and walk from various places around the world out to the Everest area. So we'll see if we can just stream that and see if it works for about 1.5 minutes. Okay, so hopefully everybody had the bandwidth to enjoy that a little bit. That's compliments of David Brashears at Glacier Works. They shot that from a helicopter, and I think they had 16 cameras mounted around the front of it, and it's probably one of the most unique views of Everest. I believe we'll have this presentation up on the Jagged Globe site afterwards, so you can view it again there if you want to. I think the thing about going back to Everest is quite an amazing journey up the valley with the Sherpa team that you're going to climb with, perhaps with some trekkers alongside. Last year I hiked up with my daughter Phoebe. We went into base camp, and really when you get there as an expedition, the first thing you start doing is organizing all this stuff, which is you haven't seen in a few months, and suddenly you're like, where did all these kind of chocolate bars come from? And I think when I went there in '88, we were a vegetarian expedition, and Stephen Venables, the first thing he said was, "I don't see any meat." And we said, "Oh, by the way, we're a vegetarian expedition." He's like, "Oh no, we're all going to die." So you sort all this out. And the interesting thing about when you look across the 7 summits on the map and the kind of profile of these peaks, you're at base camp, you're already almost as high as most of the tops of the other summits of the world that you may have climbed if you're doing all the 7 summits. And by the time you get to the top of Aconcagua, you're really only at Camp 2 on Everest. So one of the first real fears you have is just how are you going to feel and how are you going to acclimatize? The great thing about base camp is it's a very social place. We were there in 2003 with Borge Olsland, who's probably one of the world's greatest polar explorers, and he came up and climbed with us on Everest. He has a very interesting perspective, and we certainly learned a lot from him. David Hamilton was there on his first attempt of 10 on the mountain, and I think you're also surrounded by a whole range of things which suddenly put you in the mountain environment. Of course, the avalanches in both 2014 and then subsequently in 2015 with the earthquake, you know, they're coming down around you. You're waking up to where you are. And as much as a lot of the pictures I'm going to show you today are in the daytime, you do 90% of your climbing, it seems, at night. You have your headlamp on, you're hopefully not stumbling around too much. It tends to be very cold, but the weather's better and it's a lot more calm. So you climb at night out of base camp, leaving at 2, 3 in the morning. On your summit bid, you might even leave earlier. I think when people get to base camp, one of the first things they think is, oh my gosh, here I go. Am I fit enough to climb the mountain? And there's a fear of being strong, and you go up into the ice fall on the right. And I remember one of the first times I was there, somebody said, you know, Robert, I've never done these ladders before. I'm really quite frightened. And I said, well, you know, I've been climbing for 30 years and I've never done a ladder on a climb either. So join the group. There's not a lot of mountains in the world where you have to clamber up or down these ladders. But you go out into this amazing space. You're out there occasionally all on your own. Things are toppling down around you, and you go up one day and you think it's okay, and then you go up the next day and everything is pretty much like falling off. And I was up there the first time with Sibusiso Bulan, and he didn't have a lot of climbing experience. He was happy to admit, and I'd been quite hard on him, I think, like making sure his crampons were working correctly and he was getting his feet in the right place because the efficiency is so important. And Sibu, he was taking it very well and he was getting better. He had an amazing sense of balance and such a great kind of perspective. And I looked out and said, you know, how you doing? And he said, you know, that ice over there, Robert, that looks like a lion kind of that I know from the park. And I thought this guy's got the right attitude to get up Everest, because here we are in the middle of the ice fall and he's telling me lion stories. And I knew then that he had pretty much the psychology to get up the peak, and he was certainly more than fit than a lot of us. So we had a very successful climb up the mountain. The great thing is you come out of the ice fall and you're up in the Western Cone, kind of the Valley of Silence. And Pumori behind us, and we're looking back down, and somebody's headed down at the end of the day. And it's relatively easy climbing up there. A lot of us you're just walking along, maybe carrying a ski pole, a few fixed ropes, and a couple of ladders. It's interesting that in 1953, almost exactly the same kind of viewpoint we had, them walking up across there, the porters carrying loads up through the ice fall, all probably roped together. And in some ways, that challenge of Everest hasn't really changed. Climbing up the mountain, going higher, facing the altitude and some of your fears. Looking up through the Western Cone, you see Lhotse in the background there. Then you go into the southwest face of Everest, and just at the bottom, you tuck into Camp 2. So you've been all the way up the mountain now. You head back down, get another view out over Kumbutsi on the right-hand side, all these ice falls, which occasionally seem to fall off and hit people on the head, sadly. And you return to base camp, but really at this point, your fitness is not so important. It's really, do you really want to take yourself up into that environment and literally put yourself at quite high risk going through the ice fall? But you play a few games of cards and you go to the internet cafe, you have a few cinnamon rolls, and then you head back up the mountain again on another rotation. And this is when you get to go up to the Lhotse face. You're straight off the Bergschrund, and then you're straight up the hill. This is shot taken a bit later in the expedition, so you've got some footsteps. But early on, it's pretty much brick hard ice. And this is when you start out in the morning and it's cold, then it gets hot, then the wind blows, as you see here, coming off the top of Everest up above you. You arrive at Camp 3. It's oftentimes stormy and freezing. You have your choice of 3 locations in Camp 3. You could sleep in the top tent and have the avalanches coming down on you. You could sleep in the bottom tent, which is falling off the mountain, as you can see. You could sleep in the middle one, which is relatively flat and looks secure, but if you look below it, that's where the crevasse is, and that's why it's a bit flatter there. So it's kind of your choice of evils when you get up to Camp 3. You do that, you sleep there, and it's not all that different from what they experienced in 1953. They obviously had bigger packs. Their gear wasn't quite as good. Their oxygen was far heavier, but they're still hanging out in their tents, trying to acclimatize. They seem to find a slightly flatter place than we did. And then you head back down the mountain. The good thing about it is in Camp 3 and above, usually you're on oxygen, depending on how brave or foolish you are. And you can retreat to base camp. I tend to break the rules, and I usually have a pet in base camp that follows me up the trail. Not really recommended, but it's always nice to come back to your tent and have your dog there. So the thing that you really start looking at once you're back in base camp is there's this interminable waiting period. And it's interesting that right now the Chinese are facing exactly the same thing. As I mentioned, they made 2 attempts this year. Very strong team on the north side, still haven't made it. It tends to be a bit colder. And at this point in time, we're watching the weather very closely. We're getting daily, if not hourly, weather reports at times. This is quite a unique shot. A year after I did Everest, I did Makalu. So this is a shot of Everest from the east, looking west at the mountain. The South Col is just in between the clouds there. And the summit ridge, which you climb up to the top, is on the right, just visible in front of the clouds there. So finally, you get the right weather, and you head back up the mountain. This is moving up out of Camp 3. If you time it right, you don't have too long of a wait when you get up there. We go out early in the morning. We tend to, and we stay out of those big lines that are behind us there. And you move up the mountain. And in this shot, it's quite a unique one, looking out across the Geneva Spur, and way up, down low, yeah, yeah, way up high, you've got a couple of climbers just coming down off from the south summit, leaving the top. You can just see how big they are, so kind of get a sense of scale. And then down at the bottom on the left, a couple of climbers are headed up, and that's on the Geneva Spur, and you go up there and around the corner, and you're on the South Col. So you do that early in the morning. You arrive up at just under 8,000 meters, and you look up this face, and as you can see above us, this kind of mixed ground. You follow a track that goes out across the snow and ice here, heads up. The line pretty much stops at the balcony, which is really about halfway to the summit. You get there in about 4 hours if your timing is right. And then you head off to the left and on up to the summit. So at this point, you've kind of faced your fears. You've put all that behind you. You know you're fit enough if you're South Col. And at this point, it's a little bit about the faith side of things. And it's not necessarily religious. It's more of a, do you have the belief in yourself that you can climb up through the night into the dawn the next morning and actually get to the top of the peak. Meanwhile, kind of battling through the different conditions and the storms that occasionally come up and then hopefully blow away. If you're fortunate enough, when the sun comes up, you look out to the east and you can see Makalu, and just stepping back, the sun comes up a bit further and it kind of radiates the whole world. And it's perhaps one of the most beautiful sunrises in the world. It's worth going up Everest just to see the sunrise from that summit ridge. And I'm sure there's a few people that are listening that can't help but agree. I think the other thing is you look out to the west and you suddenly realize a small part of the world that you're on is suspended in the horizon. If you get a perfectly clear day like we did here, this triangle of Everest slowly grows in the horizon and becomes more and more prominent, looking out there over the top of Nuptse, and then on up. You go a bit higher and it's kind of settles down into the earth. You can just see the peaks of the Himalayas there. And the great thing about Everest is it doesn't disappoint. You do definitely feel like you're on top of the world. if you're not up there with too many people, certainly it's some very fine climbing. There's usually good conditions. The snow's not too deep. You finally get to the south summit and you look across at that summit ridge. And it's like, well, thank God it's not an easy walk up to the top, because you got this amazing crest with the southwest face on the left going down into Nepal, and then on the east face on the right dropping down into Tibet. Just moving forward, look over somebody's shoulder, and this is a day when the wind was picking up quite a bit by the time we were there, just after sunrise. You see kind of a string of people there heading across, and that is right at the top of the picture. That is the actual summit right there. About halfway across, just below the people on the snows, the Hillary Step, and you see it here. In the next picture, a few people backed up, kind of lined up, and people kind of come and go a bit. The good thing about it is most of the guided groups that are there, ours and the other companies, we work together very closely so we can time our ascents. So even if you end up with something like this on the right, you go around people, you time it, you talk to people, and you kind of work it out. So it's not as bad as it might think sometimes. This is just a view literally right around the edge of the Hillary Step, looking out over to the west in Nepal. You can see the triangle of Everest is just faded right down onto the earth now as the sun starts to come up. As you move across there, over the top of the Hillary Step, this is myself and Sibu Sisu. Just before we left for the top, Sibu came over to my tent and he said, "So Robert, you've tried a few times." I think I'd tried quite a few times by then. And he said, "You haven't quite make it. Are you going up to the top this time?" And I said, "Yes, definitely. We're going to the top." And within the next 12 hours, we went up to the top. Sibu was either about 3 steps behind me, or as you see him here, about 5 steps, behind, just walking along. Got to the summit ridge and went across. Again, another shot of Sibu looking back at him here in this area. And as you can see, the climbing is not difficult, but it's not so easy that it bores you, that's for sure. Another shot here taken from Makalu, just to that summit ridge on Everest on the left. On the right is the North Ridge. And then on the left, you can just see where we climbed up along the way. The summit and that whole top of the ridge is all kind of buried in cloud. This was at dawn, taken from Makalu just a year after I summited Everest. We could look across at this view. The final few steps right up to the top of the mountain, incredible cornices off to the right, dropping down the Kangshung Face. And then finally you climb up and you get to the top of the mountain. And David Hamilton, it was his first time there of his 10 ascents that he made. And we've got this shot, which we sent off and ran in all the papers in South Africa because Sibu was the first Black African to summit Everest. But in reality, if you go to the next one, you feel more like this. And this is kind of the unretouched, slightly sideways view. I was up to the top and wandered around a bit and sat down, and Sibu came up and joined me and kind of collapsed next to me, and we sat down and had a big hug. And then David Hamilton, I'm sure, came up and said, "This looks rather pathetic. You need to at least stand up." So we did. And if you move on, another year that I was there, we were much more organized. I summited with Tim Ralph, and we had a fantastic climb. We had just great weather. We had a great, strong team. We'd gone really early, so it wasn't too busy. We even had our Sherpa get the flag out for us and hold it up in the wind. But as you can see, it wasn't bad weather at all. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous day up there with Tim. He just finished his 7 summits, which made it even more special. As we move forward, it's just so you can have one look down from the summit of the North Ridge. And so on the left there, along those cornices, is where people come up when they climb from Tibet, and then Tibet way out there. You can see it just disappears into the haze and the mist. And then looking back out to the east again, we see from the top, we see Makalu. And then on the left, perhaps even more interesting, you can see Kangshung, the 3rd highest peak in the world, which is probably, somebody will correct me, I'm sure, I don't know, give or take 100 miles away, somewhere out there in eastern Nepal. They're an amazing view of all these peaks. So you finish these off and then you start down again. And I think you've proved you're fit, you've conquered your fears. And now, as almost anything, perhaps one of the hardest parts is you really need to dig deep to get back off this mountain again safely. So you scramble back down over the summit ridge. And if you're still marginally awake, you're taking a few more pictures on the left, just shot around the corner of the south summit. You see Makalu. And on the right, if you wonder why people love climbing that Lhotse Couloir, you can see it very distinctly leading up to the top of Lhotse. Just on the right side too, you also, at the very bottom of the picture in the center, you can just see the little dots of orange, and that's actually the camp. And you go down and down and down, and then you look, and it's about the same distance away. You do that 4 or 5 times and eventually get back down. So that's kind of climbs of Everest, taken over 3 expeditions that I've done. I think that importance when you go there, yes, you got to be fit, but first off, you got to really accept it. This is a big, tall, dangerous mountain, and it's not going to be easy. I think ultimately you have to be very fit to climb it. And then finally, you have to have really the faith in yourself to get up those final steps to the top. I'm just finishing on the last slide here. I've written 3.5 books now. And the final quote I'd like to leave you with today is one from Ed Hillary. It's a touch blurry here, but then I'll show you the whole picture. And Ed Hillary, when he was on the top, he got back down and he said, what I was thinking of was actually going off to climb Makalu and tracing routes up that. And then that final paragraph here, you see these words where he says, I was still looking beyond to other interesting challenges. And then on my final page here is just the poster of Everest on the left and Makalu on the right with that quote in the middle, which kind of sums up, and I think it kind of explains where we are now in life. Some of us is how do we kind of put up with the things that we're doing and achieve what we want, but at the same time look beyond to new and perhaps more interesting challenges in the future. So thanks very much for sharing the story. I think, Tom, you can probably cover this off. Obviously, the Sherpas, we were going to be there this year. The Sherpas have struggled and had a difficult time. I've been in touch with quite a few of them. And Jagged Globe is working together to help raise some funds to get them through the year. And hopefully we can go and climb with them again next year.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, thanks so much for that, Robert. That was fascinating insight. And yeah, just to pick up there, we've still got the GoFundMe page running. I think we're still only about 2/3 of the way to our target. But yeah, thanks to everybody who's already donated to that fund. You can, if you're not and you're able to, then you can go and check that out via that link. That was great, Robert. Thank you. We're going to move to some Q&A now. So, if people want to start posting up any questions, then we can ask Robert, whether it's about Everest or any of the other 7 summits. So how many Everest expeditions in total is it that you've now been on, Robert, over the years?
Well, I've just completed a book called 9 Lives. My friend came up with the idea for this title when I realized I'd been there 9 times. And I'd had a number of expeditions when I was trying to solo the North Face and spent a ton of time up on Everest there, came back, and then the last couple of times I've been successful, but it's a total now of actually 10 times that I've been there and hopefully going 1 more again.
Great. And so you had quite a number of solo expeditions, didn't you? Sort of was that in the early 90s?
Yeah, kind of in the 90s. I was there solo, completely solo. Then I went with smaller teams. Eventually I reached 8,400 meters in the Great Couloir, but the weather was never quite what I needed it to be, and I was too lazy and tired and
Sure, yeah.
Didn't take it.
So, I mean, Miles here has just come in with a question because, what's the differences between climbing Everest in the summer, or I guess he means probably the spring and the winter time, because I know you went there in the winter.
Yeah, the winter one, it's a huge difference. And my Sherpas kind of described it as you're in base camp or you're at the bottom, and it feels like you're already at the South Pole. So it's pretty wicked. I was on the north side, which has still never had a winter ascent as far as I know. And So it's obviously a lot windier and a lot colder, but it's in degrees, it's probably not a whole lot. But the problem is when you're there now, you're kind of at your limit, and in the winter it tips it over. And as we've seen, the winter expeditions try to get through to the top, but year after year, they don't quite make it, it seems.
Sure, yeah. John here has got a question. He's asking about, so other than Everest, have you got any other interesting challenges that you're looking to do at some point?
I've been spending most of the northern winter seasons down in Antarctica, so I always enjoy going down there. I've climbed a couple of new peaks down there. I've climbed new routes on Vinson a few times, so I'll go back there whenever I can. That's just a fantastic experience. I was in the Karakoram for the first time last year, and just an amazing area, completely new and different. I'd spent so much time in the Nepal Himalayas, but just an amazing area to open up. So I'd really like to go back there and look at perhaps Broad Peak and the Gasherbans as well, to climb those. And then I'm fortunate that I've got a group of friends who like to go away every year or two. Obviously not right now. And they'll pretty much go, the more outrageous and adventurous I can come up with, the more likely we are to go there. So I'll go off and climb whatever I can find in an obscure part of the world with them.
Great stuff. Okay, we've got a question here from Mark. He says, such a great perspective. Thanks, Robert. Is there anything you could compare Everest to in terms of physical challenge? Is it as demanding or more demanding than something like a marathon a day? Well, I know you're a bit of a runner, aren't you? So
yeah, I do quite a bit of running. I just think it's so different. It's hard to compare it. I know one of the things in the danger category, I looked at the numbers and I say, well, 1.5% of the people that summit Everest die. If you took that number and put it against, say, a London Marathon, you'd get between 50 and 100 people dying a year. And most people wouldn't really find that acceptable. Maybe they would. So I think there's a danger and a risk level that's much higher. I also think that probably the most important thing on Everest is that helps you through is a crampon technique. And whereas I think hopefully most anybody can run pretty well and get through a marathon, I think the climbing skills that really get you up Everest make a huge amount of difference. I think it certainly helps to be able to run long things. I do quite a lot of trail running, and that certainly helps. But there's a whole other dimension beyond that, which is quite a lot more important. Now, I just have a news flash, actually, that just came in. Everybody can see this. There we go.
Yeah, right.
So the Chinese team's just gotten their rope fixers up to the top of Mount Everest.
Amazing.
On the 26th of May. It's a fortuitous day, I would say. At least Sibu and David and I would think so. And that's quite interesting that in a year when they've had a very strong team, they went through the first one and they went a bit early and it was too hard. The next time the weather report looked brilliant, and I can follow it and track it on my blog. And they didn't make it. And now finally they've gotten up to the top the 26th of May, which is pretty late in the season. I think it would have been a challenging year on Everest, Tom. I'm not saying I want to be there, but a little bit of a window might be good, might be useful.
Yeah, well, certainly that huge cyclone in the Bay of Bengal has has certainly pushed the season right back, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So sort of following on from the risk, sort of talking about risk there, Kat asks quite an interesting question. Is turning back on Everest a hard decision, or is it just obvious when the decision needs to be made?
I think it's probably the hardest decision most people make. You go there for all kinds of reasons, and it's a very public mountain. You can climb anything you want, and then you go to Everest, and suddenly it's like, it's Everest. And when you have to turn around, it can obviously, some people, they make the wrong decision there and they push too hard. I rarely, if ever, see anybody turn around too soon. So yeah, it can be very, very hard to turn around. I've turned around quite a few times. And ultimately, to me, it's been pretty obvious that I have to go down. But that's been particularly when I was soloed. It's like, no, I'm not going to make the top. I'm going nowhere, and I'm probably about ready to kill myself. So best to go down. When we're guiding, it's a very different level of risk assessment as to whether we should go up. And I have quite a detailed formula looking at the weather, of thinking about the terrain and the earth, of contemplating kind of how the whole team is feeling. and then looking at yourself. And it's a very good way of categorizing and working out just whether you should go up or go down various times on the mountain.
Okay, just a question here from John. So this is sort of in the sort of same kind of realm. He asks, how critical is mindset when climbing Everest, more or less important than fitness?
I think the mindset's probably more important. I think the fitness is a given. If you're not super fit, you're not going to get, you might get through the ice fall, but you're not going to get up the Lhotse Face. It's just plain hard work. It's not necessarily long. You know, if you're really feeling good and you're pretty well acclimatized, you can go up the Lhotse Face in 4 hours, 5 hours. It's like, oh, slow marathon time. Not too bad, but you have to deal with so many other things. So it's much more the whole mix of things. So it's really that mindset and building that confidence. And I think of between the fear of fitness and faith that I talk about, the fear of deciding what you want to do and overcoming those things, whatever they might be, and then that faith in yourself, those are the things that really get you up there. That's not to say you don't have to be fit. That's a given. You don't go there unless you're fit. Sure.
Yeah. So I mean, you know, working from that in terms of sort of preparation and building up to something like climbing Everest, Craig here has asked that he says Denali is often suggested as a good test peak before attempting Everest. What is it about that climb that prepares people, or do you have any other advice for peaks to climb? And Denali, of course, being the highest mountain in North America, which 6,189 meters. It's not that high, is it? But people do often cite it as a good example.
Yeah, I think it's a very good example. I think I just did Denali again last year. It's the thing about it is it's you fly into the glacier and you kind of fall out of the plane and you're on the glacier, and you either start walking or skiing, and you do that for 4 or 5 days, pulling a monstrous sled which has a mind of its own. You're pretty much roped up the whole time. It never really gets dark, and you really can't. There's no Sherpas, there's no porters, there's nobody helping you to carry your things. So it's just plain hard work, day after day after day, getting up the glacier. And then once you get up to the mountain itself, the weather is very brutal. Certainly early season, it can be very, very cold. The storms come and go quite frequently. So it's a great test piece. If anything, when I was up there last year, I was talking to my friends who's a guide, and some people, they'll go to Denali after Everest, and they're like, wow, climbing Everest was good preparation for this. Because in some ways, it's almost harder.
Sure. Okay, so if we have anybody wants to ask any more questions, just go for it now. I mean, one question that I've got is, I mean, we obviously saw quite a few photos there of Makalu, and just to get maybe a bit more sense of, you know, how something like the route that you climbed, the Jagged Globe team climbed on Makalu, how that compares to Everest by the South Col.
It's very different in lots of ways, in that obviously it's high. It's, you know, it's 8,500 meters, so you've got the elevation. But the challenging, well, there's a lot of challenging things on Makalu. One, it's a lot steeper. There's a lot more steep climbing. The second thing is, from a guide's point of view, we worked with the Sherpas fixing the ropes, which you don't really do on Everest anymore. You know, we were out in front and we were putting in anchors and fixing the ropes. Certainly up high, when I went up to the top with James and with Adele, we were more or less kind of soloing up the ridge. So you had to carry an ice axe. I think the defining thing about Everest last time I did it was I did carry my ice axe, and I always carry my ice axe, but I never actually took it off my pack during the whole expedition, which gives you an idea of the preparation. Whereas on Makalu, you've got that out. The other thing is the camps on Makalu don't seem to really, they just can't be in the right place. They're either too far apart or too close. So if people have been to Everest, if you go from Camp 2 to Camp 4, which the Sherpas do, but very few climbers do, that's the kind of day you get on Makalu.
Right.
When we did Makalu, we had a 14-hour summit day, and we were moving rather quickly and rather well. We weren't down until, you know, after dark. We started at 9 at night. We summited at 11 a.m. the next day, and then came down. And we had strong Sherpa support. We had good oxygen, but it's just a tough, tough peak. So it's also probably one of the most beautiful climbs I've done. The rock is superb, steep, fun climbing, and there's very few people there. Probably the whole time we were there, we had 50 people. And Everest has 500. So, quite different.
Sure. Yeah, quite a different experience. Craig asks about the Lhotse face. What hurts more, lungs or calves? on the Lhotse face.
At that point, that's a great question. I like that. I'd say that first time you go up there, it's your calves. They're burning. It's like, particularly before some steps are in and things like that, you're literally in places probably front pointing, and you got to have good crampon technique. So yeah, it's good to have strong calves, and you're not on oxygen yet, so you're breathing pretty heavily. But I think it's really that fitness part of going up there, making sure you're efficient in your crampons and getting your points in right. But your thighs and your calves will be burning.
Okay, so of course the commercialization of Everest is often talked about. John asked, what your thoughts are about that. I mean, quite a broad question, I guess, but
no, that's a very good question, because it's this amazingly beautiful, incredible mountain. It's the top of the world. How many times, as much as many people have been up there now, can you say you've achieved an absolute like that? So it's an incredible experience. The people I've gone with, it's certainly been a bit cliche, but it's been a high point in their life, and going across that summit ridge is absolutely incredible. If people want to choose any other ways, our route on the Kangshung Face has never had a repeat without oxygen. I think 2 teams have done it, and that's been about it. There's 15 other routes on Everest to go. There's different times of year. The whole north side of Everest has never been done in winter, like I said, as far as I know. So there's other things. To more directly answer the question, I think one of the great things about climbing is there aren't a lot of rules. There's, they don't let you really jump in a Formula One car and race around the track. Unless you're a little bit crazy, you're probably not going into a bull ring, just to pick Hemingway's Great Adventures. But you can kind of sign up and go for Everest, and you're going to find out pretty quick whether you're good enough to do it. Hopefully you've served an apprentice, you've trained, and you have an appreciation. And the South Col route on Everest, going up the ice fall through the Coombe, up on the South Col, is an incredible climb. It's a great route on an absolutely incredible mountain. So,
yeah, sure.
A lot of fun. Yeah.
Okay, great. Iona said, what would your main piece of advice to an aspiring Everest climber be?
Well, when I actually get to base camp and when I start climbing with people, the thing I look for is good crampon technique, because if you get that right, that's the best way to get up the mountain, is if you know where to put them. The fitness is there, the the belief that you can do it at some point, you got to develop that. But it's all about good crampon technique, I think, because then you can move through the ice and over the rocks really quickly and easily. Pretty simple.
Great.
What helps.
Simple. Yeah. Okay, super. Right. Well, unless we've got any more questions coming in, I think we'll leave it there, Robert. So yeah, thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tom. I just want to remind people that Tom called me a while ago, obviously with the depressing news that we weren't going to Everest this year. And before the conversation ended, I said, so does that mean I'm on the list for next year? And I was supposed to answer the question about going back to Everest commercialization. Yes, I'm still on the list to go back next year. I've communicated with a few people, and they said, okay, if you're in, I'm in. So I'd encourage people to think about joining us, even if it's for a trek up to base camp, which is fantastic, just an amazing experience, or the climb itself, which is hopefully those kind of shots from the summit ridge inspired a few people to climb a bit higher in their lives.
Great stuff. Okay, we just got a couple of last ones coming in, just saying thanks for a great talk, Robert. Yeah, we'll leave it there. So thanks for joining us, Robert, and we'll see you again soon. All right.
Thanks, Tom.
Cheers. Okay, everybody. Well, we'll wrap it up there. That was great. I hope you enjoyed that. As I mentioned, next week we're looking forward to talking to David Hamilton, who many of you will know as the leader of a dozen Jagged Globe Everest expeditions over the past sort of 2 decades. But David has also spent many seasons climbing and trekking in Pakistan. Last year, he led our first expedition in the Karakoram for just over 10 years since we'd last climbed there. So look out for well, we hope you'll join us for that next week. But look out for details of further presentations, that will be announced on our news page and Facebook, Twitter. So yeah, thanks for joining us again, and we'll see you again soon.